I would like to turn to some works by Sartre that exemplify his thinking and make it accessible to many people. No Exit, 1944. No Exit is a vehicle for Sartre's philosophical ideas. No Exit is still performed to appreciating audiences. Three people, a beauty, Estelle, a pacifist journalist, Gerson, and a lesbian, Inez, have recently died. They are placed in a highly decorated room with three color-clashing sofas. They have no mirrors, but they have a bell to call the valet and a paper knife. Sartre discusses a paper knife in Being and Nothingness as an object that has been designed, being in itself, unlike a human who has not been designed and faced with choice and action, being for itself. Each character has a terrible past. Estelle had an extramarital affair and killed the baby from that affair, causing her lover to kill himself. Gerson was cruel to his wife and cowardly in politics. He ran away from his enemies instead of standing by his principles. He was caught and shot. Inez lured the wife of her cousin away. He died, and Inez taunted her lover about killing him. Her lover burned the house down, and they both died. Each person sets about tormenting the others. They remain in bad faith and need the gaze of the other to authenticate them. Estelle craves Gerson and doesn't care if he's a coward. Inez desires Estelle. Gerson needs Inez to believe he is not a coward. They are in a state of being for others. When the door swings open, none of them have the courage to escape their intolerable situation. They are moral cowards, incapable of courageous choice. Gerson states, hell is other people. Nausea, 1938. Nausea is an important novel about an aimless young man who is writing a biography of a famous person. He is anxious and giddy because of his current freedom. He does not know how to act. He experiences a crisis when he sees and feels the enormous being in itself of a large tree. He is on his way to authenticity by the novel's end. Inspired by a jazz record, he thinks about the creative acts of the singer and the composer and determines to begin a novel. Sartre's contribution to 20th century philosophy was strong. His works still speak to many of us as we strive to deal meaningfully with our human condition. Many of us embrace the difficult path he charted for those who believe humans have a choice, and by their choices, create meaning for themselves and the world. Camus. Camus was an Algerian-born Frenchman whose early works exemplified and propagated the spread of existential philosophy. He won the Nobel Prize in 1957 for his important literary production. Camus was a brilliant and popular author whose works, as Sartre and de Beauvoir's, were embedded with his philosophic concepts. This lecture will glance at two important texts by Camus as keys to his intellectual beliefs. Camus was a non-believer, as well as most of the other French existentialists. The Myth of Sisyphus, 1942, is a brilliant exposition of existentialist thought. Camus begins his extended essay by stating that the primary question facing man is whether or not to commit suicide. When a person is faced with the meaninglessness and absurdity of life, the question is why continue to live? A person is faced with his own nature. Man demands meaning, and the world has no meaning. The absurdity lies in man's desire with regard to the world's indifference. There are two ways to commit suicide, physical and intellectual. The physical is one type of cowardice. A person lacks the courage to live out the term of life. The philosophical is to turn to God in a false transcendence. the existential man resolves to live and come to terms with life's absurdity. Camus discusses several types of partial solutions to the problem of living. The lover, Don Juan, knows the illusory nature of love. He is aware that eternal love does not exist, so he pursues one love after another. The actor lives other men's lives for a few hours on the stage, in a continuous procession of different plays and different lives, all of which are illusory. The conqueror lives in time. His conquests are illusory and will be swept away with his death. The author, states Camus, is at the extreme of absurdity. He tries to enrich mankind and yet can merely describe repetitively the fleeting efforts of man's search for meaning. He reports the ephemeral path of all people. He attempts to cover nothing with an appearance, a something that does not exist. When Camus wrote The Myth of Sisyphus, his concept of the existential hero began to emerge. Camus believed that revolt is an essential feature of mankind. Sisyphus was a rebel against the ancient Greek gods, who punished him by condemning him to everlasting labor. He is sentenced to pushing a heavy rock up a mountain, and when he reaches the top with it, it rolls back down again. He must begin anew each time. Sisyphus conquers his punishment and the decree of the gods by embracing his labor. His task is hopeless, but he is determined to continue it, accepting the terms of his rebellion. By this acceptance, he rises above his punishment. Camus pictures Sisyphus with a smile on his face because he is still in revolt. He is conscious of his fate, and his consciousness makes him happy. This happiness turns the punishment into a supreme act of self-realization. Camus' lucid poetic style and brilliant philosophic position inform the myth of Sisyphus. He has portrayed the tenets of existentialism in the story of Sisyphus and provided his readers with an exemplar of how to live life fully, deeply, and courageously. Camus' later works, such as The Plague, 1948, show that he was moving toward a resolution in which some people can work together to rise above their fate. Camus' books continued to be read by young people with a great deal of interest. He was a public intellectual and was known to possess moral authority. While he later moved on from existentialism, he was a highly important and visible member of the philosophy. He came to believe that humans, by working together, can create new values. Simone de Beauvoir. Simone de Beauvoir. This portion of the lecture will glance at two important volumes by de Beauvoir as she explained her philosophy through very accessible nonfiction and novels. De Beauvoir, an atheist, published The Second Sex in 1949. She had worked on it for 2 years. Although de Beauvoir was unmarried and childless, a writer, teacher, and intellectual who had equal status to men, she had begun to think about women's place in society. The Second Sex is a seminal volume in the women's movement. Beauvoir talks about the ways in which men conceive of women and then how women in turn define themselves as objects. Woman lives in what de Beauvoir calls immanence, a constant round of uncreative and repetitious duties until she dies. Beauvoir states that woman remains in a state of waiting until death comes, and in the meantime, she is bored to death. Beauvoir rejects essentialism, the belief that woman has a biologically determined nature. She states, woman is not born, but rather becomes a woman. When The Second Sex was published, it created something of a scandal, but it is now considered a framework for the field of feminist scholarly inquiry. It is important for current readers to keep in mind that Beauvoir critiqued women's position from an existentialist point of view. Reviewers frequently fail to discern this undercurrent in The Second Sex. While a number of readers find the text dated in sections, it remains an important document for the women's movement. De Beauvoir's Ethics of Ambiguity, published in 1949, is a significant volume for two reasons. The first is that de Beauvoir writes more clearly about the tenets of existentialism than Sartre does in Being and Nothingness. Sartre's work is difficult and obscure, while de Beauvoir's writing is very accessible. She clearly articulates a viable existentialist way of living. The second reason is that de Beauvoir discusses the nature of childhood experience. Sartre had ignored this issue in his works, which is contradictory to the concept that man is born with no nature. A child, clearly, is not free. Ethics attempts to explain that existentialism is not a moral nihilism, and that it is possible to create an ethics of ambiguity that does not deny a priori that separate existences can at the same time be connected, which is similar to Camus' existential position in The Plague. Existentialism, in the words of some scholars, is a philosophical life stance that leaves us with no excuses. We decide who we want to be and what we want to accomplish. If we are determined and courageous, we may reach those goals. Remember that Sartre said our success was not guaranteed against the world's resistance. But what is important is becoming the person who will roll the rock of self-actualization up the hill of worldly resistance for as long as it takes to become a complete human being. Skepticism. Not all skeptics are atheists, but skepticism is a life stance so common to secular thinkers that a glance at skeptic philosophy will be of interest to people in the secular community. Skepticism in the Western world began with the ancient Greeks. There were two forms at that time, assertive and non-assertive. Plato's Academy, 387 BCE to 83 BCE, originated assertive skepticism. Socrates in the 5th century BC claimed that the only thing he knew was that he knew nothing. Arcelius also asserted that nothing was known. After him came Carneades, who maintained the stance that no knowledge was possible. The two Academy philosophers took an assertive, argumentative approach to skepticism. Non-assertive skepticism began in the 4th century BCE and is called Pyrrhonism. Pyrrho of Elis is considered the founder of skepticism by many scholars. His works have been lost, and all we know of his philosophy is from the text of Sextus Empiricus, 2nd century CE. Ancient Pyrrhonism was not an epistemology because it had no theory of knowledge and worked to undermine more dogmatic epistemologies. This total suspension of judgment was called eparchy. It was a step on the way to mental tranquility, ataraxia aria. Non-assertive skepticism entertains no judgments and accepts the world as it is, a type of life philosophy, a means to attain the good life.